What's up everyone, my name is Mark Hawk and today we're doing another side-by-side with the GoPro Hero4 Session up against the Xiaomi Yi. Now we're going to put these cameras through a variety of tests all throughout Santa Monica. There's a ton of great stuff in here. You could use any of these quick links to jump to the section you're most interested in, otherwise sit back and we'll start playing them all in just a second. Anyway, let's get to it. So we're going to start by taking a look at both of these cameras during the daytime at 30 frames a second. Now we're primarily going to be at 1080p throughout most of this video unless it's otherwise mentioned, but we're really trying to just see most of the basic differences here. Like this shot is really good at establishing what each camera's sort of color profile is, but it will become a little more apparent that the Xiaomi Yi sort of had a tendency to lean on green a little bit more. The GoPro Hero4 Session, when it plays the color balance right, does it super well, but sometimes it'll just accidentally warm it up a little too much, but that'll become a little more noticeable as we go on. But right now what we really want to focus on is lens rectification. Now in the Xiaomi Yi, it has the ability to undistort the footage, so you can basically take the footage, and you know how when you get that wide field of view you kind of have that curvature towards as you get towards the edge of the screen? But with the Hero 4, we generally will do a medium field of view, and what that will do is it'll crop it in the middle, so we don't really see that extreme distortion towards the end of the frame. But it's possible to get rid of that lens distortion by sort of doing the opposite curvature. Basically, using a mathematical equation, you can get rid of a lot of that lens distortion, and the Xiaomi Yi has that built in. So basically, we're going to lose the sides of our footage because if we undistort it and we kept that in, it would be all sort of out of shape, and it would sort of start curving in the opposite direction. And also, you wouldn't have really clean-cut corners. So you'll see here on the left, we have the Hero 4 Session at medium field of view, and it seems like we've gotten rid of some of that lens distortion, but really we've just sort of zoomed in on the lens. With the Xiaomi Yi, we're actually reversing some of that curvature, and you could really see that on that ocean line. So we're going to go through 2 or 3 shots of this and really just sort of emphasize what the camera is actually doing, what the pros and cons of this are. One of the negatives is as you get towards the edge of the screen, your distortion actually kind of goes to the opposite. So instead of curving off to the right and kind of getting smaller or tighter, we're actually going to sort of expand out. So in that last shot, you'll notice that the skyscraper, the hotel in the background, as it gets towards the edge of the screen, it actually sort of gets really big in scale. So if you're doing it and there's things that are close up in frame, you might see a lot more distortion, but generally on like establishing shots like this will be really good at sort of hiding a lot of that distortion. And while I'll try and minimize the effect with YouTube compression, I am noticing the Hero 4 Session still has a tendency to actually hold a better sharpness. Now, along with being able to do wide field of view, the Hero 4 Session actually can do super view. So what super view is if you think of us having a sort of taller frame here, you notice how we have everything sort of cropped out at 16:9. Imagine being able to take a little more on the left and right and top and bottom and just sort of squeeze them down into this 16:9 picture. So with this super view mode, we're actually able to see a lot more of our surroundings, and you can easily see that compared to the wide to the super view. So we go back, you see we have less on the sides, and then with super view we actually will capture more. Now when we do that, we have a ton of extra lens distortion that is added, but what this is really good for is kind of the opposite of what lens rectification is good for, is tight spaces. So when we're in a tight space and we don't really have the extension, like maybe we have a selfie stick but it's not too far, but we want to capture sort of the grand vastness of everything around us, we can turn that camera into super view and capture a ton more. Now if you look at the Xiaomi Yi, you'll notice that in those grays, especially on that catwalk on the left, or the gray concrete I guess, you'll notice a tendency to it have a little more of a greenish tint to it. And even though I said before the Hero 4 Session had a little more sharpness when I'm looking at these renders raw, it's not too far off from the Xiaomi Yi. If anything, it's just doing a really good job with better contrast, and I am able to see those circles, but it's really not that far off from the Xiaomi Yi in terms of sharpness and clarity. The Xiaomi Yi just has a very big tendency to pump in a little more green. Now these stairs here that's a very rich red in reality, and the Hero 4 Session is basically nailing that color profile, while the Xiaomi Yi is a little bit washed out, but that's nothing we couldn't fix a little bit later in post. But if you're someone that's not going to be messing around in post, that might be kind of a concern for you. Here we're also taking a look at the depth of field while we're doing this shot, just seeing what's really sharp up close as opposed to all the way at the top of the stairs, and both of them to me feel pretty much on par. They're not the sharpest images you can have out there, but they're definitely within the acceptable parameter. Nothing really weird is happening the further we go out into the distance. So when the Hero 4 Session is nailing its color balance, it's doing a really good job of it. This image feels really well balanced. It's not too warm, it's not too cool. None of the red, green, or blue channels are doing anything weird. And it's got a good level of contrast. Nothing really feels washed out. The Xiaomi Yi is not far off, especially when you look at things like the cars in the parking lot in the distance. There's a good amount of specular highlights on there and stuff like that. Things look really good. Now, in terms of battery life, the GoPro Hero4 Session is going to last longer. It's going to give you around 2 hours in straight recording at 1080p, 30 frames a second, while the Xiaomi Yi in straight recording is going to get about 55 minutes, but the Xiaomi Yi does have a slight battery defect. Unfortunately, with some of the earlier units that were shipped, and I don't know if this was ever resolved, but there's basically a battery drain when the camera's not in use or not in full use that's pretty severe. So a lot of times I was changing out batteries during the side-by-side at around the 25 to 35 minute mark for the Xiaomi Yi. We actually went through 3 batteries throughout the entirety of this day. But with the Hero4 Session, we didn't have to switch out the battery at all. Now this scene is really good for looking at a lot of fine detail. We just have a lot of things to look at here that can cause problems. The strings that are kind of going over this walkway, they can be very anti-alias. We might not see a ton of the information. Some of them might seem transparent, just because there's just a lot of light wrapping around them. We have the gates as we look through at the cars behind there. With gates, there's a lot of times for this weird sort of strobing or streaking effect to happen just because the image can't really define kind of what's behind the gate because there's just too much information in front of it. Now here at the end of the bridge is a beautiful array of colors. Again, these cameras aren't too far off in the color spectrum wise, but they're really good at making really saturated colors pop and look very appealing. If I wanted to be a little nitpicky, during playback on the GoPro Hero4 Session, the strings above it look pretty nice. Again, during playback and on my end, there's not a whole lot of compression that's really affecting me, but when I switch over to the Yi, even with no compression, I'm seeing a lot of weird sort of graininess in the strings above, and I'm pretty sure some of that's going to play through in the Hero4 Session footage here when we have it side by side. But just looking at the raw footage when it's stopped at full bitrate, it looks pretty good. And again, the Xiaomi Yi is not far off. Seafoam is another really good area to take a look at clarity and image detail because there's just so much information, so many sharp edges. Again, on my end, the Hero4 Session, just a slightly crisper image, but the Xiaomi Yi, again, not far off. And the reason why I kind of keep stressing that it's not far off is because the Xiaomi Yi is basically a $65 to $85 camera. Now, back in the day, it used to be kind of hard to get because you had to import it from China, but now you could just go onto Amazon and order it. And I'm not a huge fan of its interface system. I really needed a phone to kind of switch modes and stuff like that to really use it throughout the entirety of the day, but the Hero4 Session isn't too far off from that either because it's got a very lack of buttons. You basically have to connect it to a phone to change any of the settings, going from photo mode to video mode. You can do time-lapse mode fairly easy, but again, it kind of requires a phone. So they're very similar cameras when it comes to interface because they're not really meant to be used without a phone app if you want to change the settings. Now here we're looking at everything at 720p at 120 frames a second wide field of view. Again, not too many issues, nothing too unexpected with slow motion. We are limited to doing 720p at 120 frames a second, but the results are kind of what we'd expect. Actually, the Xiaomi Yi does take a bigger hit on quality loss when we go out of 1080p, 30 frames a second. The GoPro Hero4 Session holds up a little better. Things like anti-aliasing, sort of how those sharp edge lines sort of look as they kind of like go down. You might see those sort of jaggies as it kind of does the diagonal thing. But when we switch back to 1080p, 30 frames a second, the Xiaomi Yi looks great. But when we go outside of like those frame modes, like 60 frames a second or 120 frames a second, the Yi has a tendency to sort of take a dip in quality, but it's up to you to kind of determine, is it taking like a $300 hit in quality, because that's how much more you would have to pay to get the GoPro Hero4 Session. But when you're getting shots like this, the Xiaomi Yi just comes off as a great image, especially when you're not comparing it to another camera on their own. The Xiaomi Yi's footage stands out, and it's really good. Like the Hero4 Session, again, if we're looking at these seafoam waves on my end, the seafoam just a little more clear, there's a little more sharper. There's a bit of a softness with the Xiaomi Yi, but if you're filming in 1080p, I think it's an excellent camera. Most of my problems with the Yi stem from things like bad quality at higher frame rates, its battery life issues, and audio is a big one actually. So we'll take a look at the audio here in this next session with the Xiaomi Yi. It also is good to point out that the Hero4 Session is using this new front and back microphone technology that's really good at eliminating wind noise.
like a wildfire out of control. Till there was nothing to go, nothing to go. Remember what you said to me. It's more than you ever will. Remember how she held me on so tight.
So here we're going to be diving into the underwater section, but I do want to point out in our last test with the audio, neither of the cameras were in their waterproof housing. Well, that is to say the Xiaomi Yi wasn't in its waterproof housing. The Hero4 Session is actually built into its waterproof housing, so it's impossible to get it out of there. But the way it gets around a lot of its muffled sound issues is by a new dual microphone system. So it has a microphone in the front and a microphone in the back, and depending on the sound quality it's detecting, it can actually shift which microphone is recording. So if you're driving with the camera and there's a lot of wind noise in the front microphone, it'll pick it from the back. If you're talking into the camera but it finds the audio in the back of it a little more appealing, it'll switch it to that. The Xiaomi Yi was out of the case and just basically had nothing obstructing it in the last test, and yet it still had a really hard time picking up audio. Now here we're underwater. The Xiaomi Yi has a tendency to sort of white balance it a little more teal. Hero4 Session, again, when it nails color balance, it does a really good job of it. Normally, like, we would have to put a red filter on our camera in order to get something as balanced as this with previous GoPro Hero cameras. Even the Hero4 Silver and the Hero4 Black have a tendency to sort of do weird things with the color, but the Hero4 Session, in my experience, has done a really good job of balancing those out. The Xiaomi Yi isn't shifting the colors around anything crazy, but it also never really finds a good balancing point throughout any of this. So it's got some good and some bads, but quality-wise, both of these have flat lens cases. For the Xiaomi Yi, it doesn't actually ship with an underwater case, so that is an aftermarket cost for you, but you're looking at about 15 bucks, which isn't too much. And again, the Hero4 Session is built into its dive housing, and you can actually go, I think, 15 feet, but there have been people who have done tests that have gone way below 15 feet with the Hero4 Session and had no issues. So if you're in like a 20-foot, 25-foot diving area, you might be able to get away with it, but it would not be covered under warranty at that point if something did go wrong. Now, as we move into low light, we're going to see some different things. Now, the reason why I kind of go through daytime, low light, and nighttime is because each camera does some weird different things depending on its settings. Like the Xiaomi Yi right now is a little darker and a little more contrast, while throughout the entirety of this video, it's been kind of the opposite. Now, the Xiaomi Yi here has a really nice balanced image, and that's again because we're sort of pumping up that green a little bit more. It's making our shot a little more balanced. The Hero4 Session, the whites have a little bit more red in it, and you'll notice a lot more dancing grain in the shot. Now, when we move to sort of nighttime settings and low light settings, most cameras will use our ISO to bump up the brightness. That way we have a more appealing image. But what this is doing is it's artificially boosting our pixels, so we kind of get that dancing grain like we saw on the left side there. Now you notice the Xiaomi Yi doesn't have a lot of that dancing grain because it's basically using a degrainer to kind of soften the image a little bit and make it more appealing. And while the overall shot looks nice, the sort of downside to this is it makes our image a lot softer than if we didn't degrain the footage. You can actually get these same results with the Hero4 Session, but you'd have to do it in post. So if we're using our Xiaomi Yi as a dash camera, we'll have a really nice degrained image, but license plates and clarity, those things might be missing. But for adventure videos, it's definitely a huge plus. Now the Xiaomi Yi in the shot looks really awesome. It's a really good sort of low light sort of setting with the sort of nice blue sky. Everything looks really well balanced. But that's mainly because of the luck of the green just sort of pumping up a little more. But I'll take that over the GoPro Hero4 Session. It looks like very red, sort of very noisy. We do have a little more clarity, especially like look at those street cars in the lower left, that sort of red line of cars. When we look at those two side by side, you're going to notice on the Hero4 Session, again, they're a little bit sharper, a little bit more crisp, but we have a ton of dancing green. The shot is a little bit too more red. It's taking a lot of that amber light and sort of just producing that throughout the entirety of that shot. So it's kind of a shame. But for the most part, the sharpness is there, but with the Xiaomi Yi, it just looks so nice in low light. So if you're just using it for adventure videos, it comes out really cool, and I don't think the softness is really going to ruin most of your videos. And lastly, we're going to take a look at photos here real quick, but actually what you can do is you can go to the more information section below this video and download all of the raw photos that you see on screen here and actually just see a lot of these quality differences for yourself, uncompressed. It's a really small file. I highly recommend you check that out. But for the most part, the GoPro Hero4 Session is an 8 megapixel image sensor at a resolution of 4000 by 3000, while the Xiaomi Yi is at a 16 megapixel image sensor at a resolution of 4608 by 3456. Image sensor wise, Xiaomi Yi is twice as powerful, but I really feel when you're looking at these photos, like look at those oranges, look at those curves on the left. Like both of these cameras are doing a fantastic job. 8 megapixels, 16 megapixels. Take a look at those raw images and just tell me for yourself if you're really seeing a ton of difference in these. Color balance wise, I think the Xiaomi Yi here, like, just again has a really nice sky because it's boosting those greens. Hero4 Session just has a lot of contrast, but again, download those images and you'll see these images a lot more clearly than you're seeing on your screen now. Anyway, that's going to wrap up our side-by-side of the GoPro Hero4 Session up against the Xiaomi Yi. Let me know what you thought in the comment section below, and be sure to leave your questions again before you leave. Like, subscribe, and if you're feeling super generous and you found this video helpful, head on over to my Patreon page and maybe make a little donation, because all of MarkRawCam is run completely out of pocket, and trust me, our overhead is way more than anything I get back. Again, if you can't donate though, be sure to share this video and pass it along, especially as we go into the holiday season. We're going to have a ton more videos here, just a lot more cameras to compare, a lot more features, and yeah, things are just building up here, and there's just a ton more to do. I got some big announcements in the next few weeks, so again, be sure to like, subscribe, and yeah, appreciate you guys, and everyone, have a good one. I'll see you out there.